What if I told you one of the most famous stories in early Christianity isn't about ancient conquerors, but about a young mother and a pregnant slave who refused to abandon their faith, even when the world demanded their death? A young noblewoman with a nursing baby and a pregnant slave walked into a Roman arena together, and the empire could not make either of them deny Christ. On the 7th of March, the Catholic Church keeps the memorial of Saints Perpetua and Felicity, two early Christian martyrs who died at Carthage in Roman North Africa in the year 203. Their names are remembered together because their witness was given together, their story was preserved together, and Christian memory has never really separated them. Even today, the Church in the United States marks them on March 7th as an optional memorial, and their names are still honored in the ancient Roman canon of the Mass. Perpetua was known in full as Vibia Perpetua. She appears in the surviving account as a young woman of noble birth, well-educated, and already a married matron. She had a father and mother, two brothers, and an infant son whom she was still nursing. The text says she was about 22 years old at the time of her arrest and death. That single detail makes the story hit even harder because she was not a distant legend from old age, but a very young mother standing at the beginning of adult life. Felicity, called Felicitas in the Latin text, stood in a very different social position. She was a slave and she was arrested with the same Christian group. She was also already 8 months pregnant when the day of execution drew near. That contrast is one of the reasons their story became so famous in Christian history. A noblewoman and a slave woman, divided by Roman society, were united completely in the confession of Christ. The empire ranked them differently, but martyrdom placed them side by side. They were not alone. Their companions included Revocatus, who was also a slave, along with Saturninus, Secundulus, and Saturus. The sources describe most of them as catechumens, meaning they were still preparing for baptism when they were arrested. According to the ancient account, they were baptized after their arrest. Their detention came during the persecution associated with Emperor Septimius Severus, after a prohibition on conversion to Christianity was enforced at Carthage by the governor Hilarion. What makes Perpetua especially important is that part of her story survives in her own voice. The work known as The Passion of Saints Perpetua and Felicity preserves Perpetua's prison diary and also material connected with Saturus, while the final account of the execution was added by another contemporary narrator. That makes the text one of the earliest and most remarkable Christian writings associated with a woman, and one of the most famous martyr texts from the early church. It is not only devotional literature, it is also an extraordinary historical window into early Christian identity, suffering, and hope. One of the most dramatic parts of the story is Perpetua's conflict with her father. He repeatedly begged her to save herself. He appealed to family affection, to her youth, and to the child depending on her. Perpetua answered with the clarity for which she is still remembered. When her father tried to persuade her to call herself something other than Christian, she replied that a thing cannot be called by another name than what it is, and neither could she call herself anything other than what she was. That exchange has echoed through Christian history because it reduces everything to identity. Not convenience, not fear, but survival. Who are you really? Her father did not stop pleading. The account presents him as a tragic figure, broken by grief and desperation. He returned again before the trial and again before the execution. Perpetua clearly loved him, and that is what gives the scene its force. This is not a saint rejecting a stranger. This is a daughter refusing a father because she believed loyalty to Christ stood above even the most natural human bond. That theme is so central that the Church's suggested gospel for their memorial includes Christ's words about loving him above father, mother, son, or daughter. Perpetua's prison account also includes a series of visions. These visions are one reason she became one of the most discussed women in early Christianity. She saw a ladder rising to heaven, guarded by danger, with a dragon lying at its foot. She saw herself climbing upward and entering a heavenly place. Later, she saw herself transformed for combat, wrestling and overcoming an Egyptian opponent, a symbolic image of spiritual victory before the public execution had even begun. These visions were not treated by early Christians as decorative details. They were read as proof that martyrdom was not defeat, but entrance into triumph. Another vision made Perpetua especially important in later Christian reflection. She prayed for her dead younger brother Dinocrates, who had died at about 7 years old after a disfiguring illness. In her first vision, she saw him thirsty, miserable, and unable to reach water. After persistent prayer, she saw him again, now refreshed, clean, and joyful. That passage later became significant in Christian thinking about prayer for the dead because it presents intercession as truly helping a departed soul. Even when later theologians debated its implications, the passage remained one of the most striking scenes in the whole text. Perpetua also had to suffer something painfully immediate, not only mystical. She was a mother with a baby in prison. The text shows her anxiety over her infant son and the physical suffering connected with nursing. Eventually, the child was allowed to stay with her for a time, and later, according to the account, the child no longer needed the breast in the same way. This matters because the martyrdom was not abstract. It involved the tearing apart of the most basic human attachments. The story became famous not because it ignored natural love, but because it showed faith enduring precisely where natural love was strongest. Felicity's ordeal was different, but no less intense. Because Roman custom did not allow the public execution of a pregnant woman, she feared being separated from the others and dying later, apart from her companions. Her fellow martyrs shared that grief, and 3 days before the games, they all prayed together. The prayer was answered quickly. Felicity went into labor in prison and gave birth to a daughter. When a guard mocked her pain and asked how she would endure the beasts if she could barely endure childbirth, she answered with a line Christians never forgot. Now, she said, it is she who suffers, but then another would be in her because she would be suffering for him. After the birth, a Christian woman took the baby and raised her as her own daughter. The day of execution was linked to public games held in honor of the imperial household, specifically the birthday celebration of Geta Caesar, according to the ancient account. The prisoners were led from the jail into the amphitheater at Carthage. The narrator says they went with joy rather than fear. Perpetua was described as walking with the composure of a matron of Christ. Felicity rejoiced that she had now given birth in time to suffer with the others. This is one of the reasons the Church has always seen them not simply as victims, but as witnesses who consciously embraced what was before them. Before the violence even began, there was another confrontation. Condemned were expected to wear costumes associated with pagan religious figures. The men were to be dressed like priests of Saturn, and the women in costumes associated with Ceres. The martyrs refused. They had agreed to die, but not to participate in false worship on the way to death. The request was ultimately dropped, and they entered as they were. That detail matters because it shows the precision of early Christian conscience. They were not resisting Rome in a vague emotional sense. They were refusing idolatry down to the last public gesture. The crowd demanded cruelty. According to the narrative, the prisoners were scourged as they passed. Then came the animal attacks. The men faced beasts assigned to them. Perpetua and Felicity were exposed before a wild cow or heifer in the arena, a scene meant to humiliate as much as to injure. Perpetua was tossed and fell, but instead of collapsing into panic, she adjusted her torn clothing to preserve her modesty. Then, seeing Felicity injured, she went to her and helped lift her up. That moment captures the entire meaning of their feast. Even in the arena, they did not become isolated individuals. They remained companions. The account of their final moments is among the most famous in martyr literature. After the attacks, those still alive were brought out for execution by the sword. The martyrs exchanged the kiss of peace. Satyrus died first. Perpetua, however, was struck badly by a young gladiator whose hand shook. The narrator says she herself guided the wavering hand to her throat. Whether read as literal detail, literary emphasis, or both, the point is clear. She did not die broken by terror. She died in conscious and willing fidelity. Neither Perpetua nor Felicity is known for the kind of later miracle stories that often appear in medieval saint biographies. The greatest miracle, in the way the early church understood the word, was the miracle of steadfastness. Perpetua's visions, especially the one involving Dinocrates, were treated as signs of divine favor. Felicity's delivery before the execution was also seen by Christians as providential, since it allowed her to die with her companions. But unlike later saints in the formal canonization era, they were not advanced through a modern legal process built around posthumous miracle investigations. That brings us to canonization and beatification. For saints this early, there was no later Vatican trial, no beatification ceremony, and no canonization decree by a modern pope. They are honored as pre-congregation saints, meaning their sanctity was recognized by the ancient church itself and handed down through continuous liturgical veneration. Their authority in Christian memory is actually older than the formal procedures used in later centuries. In other words, no pope centuries later made Perpetua and Felicity saints. The church received them as saints from the age of the martyrs. Their fame spread very widely. Writers in the Christian tradition preserved their acts. Their names entered the church's liturgy. Their witness also endured because their story combined so many unforgettable elements at once. A young mother, a pregnant slave, a prison diary, visions of heaven, a father begging for compromise, a Roman crowd demanding blood, a final act of courage under the sword. This is why they were not remembered as local figures only. They became universal saints of the Church. They are also powerful saints for a specifically Catholic reason. Their story shows that holiness is not the privilege of one class, one sex, or one legal status. Perpetua had education, family standing, and rank. Felicity had none of those things in Roman society, yet the Church remembers them with equal honor. That is one of the most striking reversals in Christian history. Rome built a world of hierarchy, but the martyr acts reveal a deeper order in which slave and noblewoman stand together before God. For modern audience, Perpetua and Felicity matter because they expose the shallowness of comfortable religion. They were not Christians when Christianity was fashionable, safe, or socially rewarded. They became Christians when conversion could cost reputation, family peace, bodily safety, and life itself. Perpetua's father offered the logic of survival. Rome offered the logic of power. The arena offered the logic of fear. The martyrs answered all three with the same response, that Christ was worth more than any of them. So when the Church celebrates the saints of the 7th of March, it celebrates more than a tragic death from the early centuries. It celebrates a witness so powerful that the voice of Perpetua still reaches across 1800 years. It celebrates Felicity, who gave birth in chains, and still entered the arena with joy. It celebrates the companionship of believers who refused to abandon one another. And it celebrates the truth that the empire can stage a spectacle of death, but it cannot force the soul to say that darkness is light. That is why Saints Perpetua and Felicity remain among the most unforgettable martyrs in all of Christian history. Being Catholic is based. Be one yourself. Subscribe for daily saints and Catholic history.